George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, into a world that balanced on the edge of wilderness and ambition. The colonies were young, fragile, ambitious, hungry, and so was the Washington family. Their home on Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia, smelled of pine resin, damp earth, and tobacco curing in wooden barns. That scent would follow George throughout his childhood, tying him forever to the land that shaped him. His father, Augustine Washington, was a stern but not unkind man, one whose life was guided by order and the steady rhythm of plantation management. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was the stronger presence, sharp-eyed, iron-willed, and endlessly demanding. Even as a boy, George felt the tension between wanting to please her and wanting to escape the pressure she created. He grew up between two worlds, one of privilege, learning the ways of landowners, the other of frontier hardship, where survival required skill and courage. It planted in him both discipline and restlessness. He was quiet, observant, and unusually tall for his age, a boy who learned not from books alone, but from woods, river currents, and the unspoken rules of adult society. At 10, George learned his first cruel lesson. Life owed him nothing. His father died in 1443, and with him went George's chance at an English education. The path he had imagined vanished. But instead of crushing him, the loss hardened him. He decided he would carve his own path, even if he had to fight for every inch of it. He didn't know it yet, but the colonies were forging him, preparing him for a role no one could foresee. The forests were thick and ancient, filled with the cries of unseen creatures and the constant hum of insects. Nights were cold, mornings colder, and the work was brutal. Yet George thrived. He rode long distances with the confidence of someone twice his age. He took measurements with precise, patient care. And at the end of each day, he recorded his observations in a neat, disciplined script, proof to himself that he was more than an ordinary young man. The frontier taught him what no tutor could: humility before nature, responsibility for others, and the importance of sound judgment. Surveying demanded accuracy, endurance, and courage, qualities that would later define his leadership. It also gave him something he desperately wanted: financial independence. By 1749, he was appointed the official county surveyor of Culpeper County. He bought land with the money he earned, learned the patterns of the land, and slowly, surely built a foundation for the life he hoped to lead. The wilderness carved George Washington into the kind of man a rising nation would one day need. Only surrender of his military career. It was a humiliation, but it forged him. He learned that courage was not enough. Discipline, logistics, and political awareness were equally vital. Though criticized by some, he was admired by others for his composure under impossible circumstances. The British Army noticed him. The colonies noticed him. George himself noticed the warrior he could become. By 1755, serving as aide-de-camp to General Braddock, he witnessed the disastrous ambush outside Fort Duquesne. Bullets tore through uniforms around him. Officers fell one after another, and yet Washington rode through the smoke, rallying survivors. 4 bullet holes pierced his coat. 2 horses were shot beneath him. He survived as if protected by fate itself. The war shaped him into a commander, one who understood both the cost of war and the fragility of victory. After the chaos of war, George longed for stability. He found it in an unexpected place, marriage. In 1759, he wed Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy young widow with 2 children. The union brought emotional warmth and significant property, but more importantly, it created a sense of home he'd never known. Mount Vernon, with its rolling plantations and sweeping views of the Potomac River, became both sanctuary and responsibility. George threw himself into improving the estate. He studied agriculture obsessively, experimenting with new crops, soil techniques, and machinery. The quiet rhythms of farm life steadied him. He rose before dawn, managed workers, wrote letters, inspected fields, and oversaw every detail of the property's growth. He was no longer the restless boy from Pope's Creek, or the brash young officer of the frontier. This period also matured his views on leadership, justice, and the mounting tensions between the colonies and Britain. Taxes, regulations, and imperial overreach stirred something deep within him. He believed in fairness, not rebellion, but events were pushing him toward a crossroads. He didn't seek greatness, but greatness was moving toward him, gathering like a storm. By the early 1770s, the American colonies were simmering with defiance. The Boston Tea Party of 1773, the Coercive Acts of 1774, and the first shots at Lexington and Concord in April 1775 pushed the colonies toward war. George Washington, now a respected landowner and veteran, found himself at the heart of the movement for resistance. He attended both Continental Congresses wearing his old military uniform, not for vanity, but as a quiet declaration. If war came, he would not shrink from duty. On June 15, 1775, Congress appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. His response was humble but firm. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." He meant it. Washington knew better than anyone how unprepared the colonies were. The army was poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly funded. Supplies were scarce, officers inexperienced, and Congress cautious to the point of paralysis. But Washington accepted the burden. He believed a cause this important required sacrifice, discipline, and unwavering resolve. He rode north to Boston to take command, knowing the path ahead would be long and full of hardship. As he approached the encampments, soldiers stood on muddy earth, hungry, disorganized, hopeful. They looked to him for leadership, and he knew he could not fail them. The year 1776 dawned with uncertainty, frost, and fear. The glow of Lexington and Concord had faded. The reality of war was darker, heavier. Washington's army was outmatched by the British in nearly every way: numbers, training, weapons, and naval power. Still, they pressed on. After forcing the British out of Boston in March, Washington braced for their return. He knew they wouldn't forgive such a setback. His instincts proved right. In July, as the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence, the British landed a massive force in New York, tens of thousands of soldiers, disciplined and ready for a swift victory. Washington fought hard, but suffered defeat after defeat. The Battle of Long Island, Harlem Heights, White Plains. He watched his army shrink, desert, and crumble in morale. By December, Washington led a desperate retreat across New Jersey, the remnants of the Continental Army hungry, shoeless, and nearly hopeless. Many believed the revolution was about to die before it had truly begun, but Washington... By 1777, the war had dragged into its third brutal year. Washington suffered another series of blows outside Philadelphia. Brandywine and Germantown fell to the British. The capital city was lost. Congress fled. Supplies dwindled. Then came Valley Forge. The winter of 1777 to 1778 carved itself into American memory. A frozen encampment of crude huts, the air thick with smoke, sickness, and hunger. Nearly 2,000 soldiers died from disease. Many had no boots, wrapping their bloody feet in rags. Washington rode among them daily, offering what comfort he could, while writing desperate letters begging Congress for supplies. The suffering was immense, but something remarkable happened too. Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived, a seasoned Prussian officer whose strict training transformed the disorganized army into a disciplined fighting force. Day after day, the soldiers drilled in the snow, learning to march, maneuver, and fight like professionals. Washington watched with pride. He had brought his men through the Valley of Despair, and out of it came a new army. When they marched out in June 1778 to meet the British at Monmouth, they were no longer a collection of farmers and volunteers. They were soldiers. The war was far from over, but Washington now commanded a force capable of winning it. By 1781, the war had shifted. The British found themselves stretched thin. The Americans, though weary, were gaining strength. Washington sensed opportunity. The French alliance proved decisive. With French ships controlling the Chesapeake and General Rochambeau coordinating on land, Washington devised a risky, brilliant plan. Instead of attacking New York, as the British expected, he marched his army south, hundreds of miles to Virginia. The movement was swift, secret, decisive. At Yorktown, British General Cornwallis found himself surrounded. Washington stood on a hillside overlooking the siege lines, a quiet intensity in his eyes. He had waited years for this moment. The siege tightened. Cannons thundered day and night. Trenches crept forward. When the British defenses finally cracked, Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781. As Washington watched the British band play the melancholy tune, "The World Turned Upside Down," he remained composed. The victory belonged not to him, he insisted, but to the soldiers, the Allies, and the cause itself. It wasn't the formal end of the war, but it was the beginning of the end. The United States had won its freedom. Peace came slowly. Negotiations dragged on for nearly 2 years, but by 1783, Washington knew the war was truly over. The British evacuated New York, and the Continental Army began to disband. What Washington did next shocked the world. On December 4, 1783, at Fraunces Tavern in New York City, he gathered his officers, the men who had marched, starved, fought, and bled beside him. The room was silent as Washington, overwhelmed with emotion, tried to speak. He managed only a few words before embracing each man in turn. It was the farewell of a leader who had given everything and asked for nothing. Later that month, he traveled to Annapolis, where Congress was meeting. There, in a simple but profound ceremony, he resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief. The most powerful man in America had willingly given up power. Kings and generals across the world took notice. Washington had proven that the American Revolution was not merely a military victory, it was a moral one. He returned to Mount Vernon, hoping to spend the rest of his life in peace. But peace would not hold him for long. The years after the Revolution were chaotic. The new nation struggled under the Articles of Confederation. States feuded, debts mounted, rebellions flared. It became clear that a stronger government was necessary. Washington, reluctantly drawn back into public life, presided over the Constitutional Convention of 1787, guiding the debates with quiet authority. When the Constitution was finally ratified, the nation turned to the one man they trusted above all others. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first President of the United States. He did not celebrate. Instead, he felt the weight settle onto his shoulders like a familiar but heavier cloak. The country was fragile, the future uncertain, and the world full of nations waiting to see whether the American experiment would fail. Washington rode to New York for his inauguration in April. As he stood on the balcony of Federal Hall, hand on the Bible, he understood the truth. The war had been difficult, but building a nation would be harder. In the earliest years of Washington's presidency, the United States felt like a fragile machine assembled from mismatched parts. Every piece needed adjusting, aligning, steadying. Washington quickly realized the presidency wasn't just about leadership, it was about invention. From 1790 to 1791, he worked closely with his cabinet, a team of brilliant but conflicting minds. Alexander Hamilton, fiery, visionary, relentless. Thomas Jefferson, philosophical, idealistic, suspicious of centralized power. Henry Knox, loyal friend and seasoned general. Edmund Randolph, a thoughtful legal mind. The debates were fierce. Hamilton's financial plan, national debt assumption, a national bank, and support for manufacturing sparked political storms. Washington, patient and steady, listened to every argument. He understood that the fledgling nation needed unity of purpose, not unity of opinion. Ultimately, he backed Hamilton. The creation of the Bank of the United States and the establishment of federal credit stabilized the economy and gave the government the authority it desperately needed. But unity came at a cost. Jefferson and Madison feared Hamilton's influence and believed Washington leaned too heavily toward centralized power. Though they respected him, the seeds of America's first political parties quietly took root under his administration. Washington felt the pressure, but refused to let personal conflict cloud national progress. His duty was to the country, not to factions. The world beyond America's shores cracked open in 1793. The French Revolution exploded into violence, and Europe plunged into war. Many Americans wanted to repay France for its support during the Revolution. Others feared entangling the young nation in foreign chaos. As president, Washington understood something the public did not. America was too weak for war. In April 1793, he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, declaring that the United States would take no side in the European conflict. It was a bold move, unpopular in some circles, condemned in others. The French diplomat Edmond-Charles Genet arrived in Charleston expecting American enthusiasm. Instead, he stirred outrage by recruiting American ships for the French cause without Washington's permission. Washington remained calm but firm, demanding Genet's recall. This crisis tested Washington's leadership more than any battlefield. He wasn't fighting armies. He was fighting passions, loyalties, and the dangerous belief that enthusiasm alone could protect a nation. In choosing neutrality, Washington set a principle that guided U.S. foreign policy for more than a century. America must protect its interests, not other nations' revolutions. The young republic faced its first major domestic test in 1794. Hamilton's tax on distilled spirits sparked rage among frontier farmers who relied on whiskey as both a product and a form of currency. Protests turned violent. Rioters torched homes, threatened tax collectors, and called for revolt. Some whispered the dangerous idea that the federal government was no better than the British crown. Washington watched events unfold with growing concern. This was no distant foreign crisis. It was a threat to the rule of law itself. When negotiations failed, Washington made a decision that shocked the rebels. He personally led the militia force assembled to suppress the uprising. At 62 years old, the president mounted his horse and rode at the head of nearly 13,000 men, the largest army he had ever commanded. The message was unmistakable. The revolution was not an invitation to chaos. Liberty required order. The rebellion dissolved almost instantly. Very few shots were fired, and the leaders fled or surrendered. Washington granted pardons to most, believing that mercy strengthened the nation far more than punishment. But the moment mattered. For the first time, the United States proved it could enforce its laws without collapsing into tyranny or anarchy. By 1796, Washington felt the weight of years pressing deeply into his bones. His hair, once a dark auburn, had long since turned white. The presidency had aged him in ways war never had. He longed for the quiet fields of Mount Vernon, for evenings overlooking the Potomac, for a life free of political storms. He decided it was time to step away. In September 1796, his farewell address was published. It was less a speech than a final message, a father speaking to his nation. He warned against political parties, foreign entanglements, and the corrosive effects of division. He urged Americans to see themselves as one people, bound by shared destiny. The address left many in tears. Even his political opponents acknowledged its wisdom. When John Adams was elected to succeed him, Washington felt relief. He attended no grand celebrations, made no dramatic farewells. Quietly, with the dignity that had defined his life, he left Philadelphia and returned home. For the first time in decades, he felt like a private citizen again. Back at Mount Vernon, Washington rediscovered the joy of ordinary days. From 1797 to 1798, he rose early, walked his fields, oversaw workers, and wrote letters about crop rotations, mule breeding, and soil erosion. Visitors arrived constantly, former soldiers, curious travelers, foreign dignitaries, but Washington remained humble, almost shy. He found peace in the rhythms of plantation life, the rustle of wheat fields in summer, the creak of barn doors, the smell of wood smoke curling from the kitchens. Yet he could never fully escape national affairs. When tensions with France escalated during the Quasi-War, President John Adams asked Washington to lead a provisional army. Washington accepted out of duty, though he hoped it would never be needed. He spent his final years balancing the quiet life he loved with the responsibilities he could never fully abandon. But another winter was coming, one that would claim him unexpectedly and swiftly. Even in retirement, Washington found himself tethered to the country he'd helped create. By late 1798, political storms grew louder. Tensions with France deepened. Congress debated military expansion, and factions tore at each other with increasing hostility. Washington remained the nation's quiet anchor. His letters to Hamilton, Adams, and other leaders showed a man still sharp, still thoughtful, but tired of the quarrels that split the country's spirit. He despised the bitterness of politics, the personal attacks, the suspicion that reason no longer guided decisions. At Mount Vernon, he reviewed military plans sent by Alexander Hamilton for the Provisional Army. Washington offered guidance, corrections, improvements, ever the careful commander. But he also told friends he hoped he'd never have to set foot on another battlefield. He wanted peace. He wanted time. He wanted the land, the quiet, and the gentle rhythm of life he had earned. But he also understood something deeper. Leadership was not a choice. It was a responsibility, one that followed him even into the quiet corners of his final years. Still, he tried to live simply. He dined with Martha each evening, visited neighbors, and walked the plantation's long paths lined with oaks. He had survived wars, political storms, and the endless weight of national expectation. He believed, perhaps for the first time, that he might truly grow old. He did not know how close the end really was. The year 1799 arrived gently. Washington spent the spring planting and planning improvements to Mount Vernon. Visitors noted how strong he looked for a man nearing 68, broad-shouldered, erect in posture, with the calm presence of someone who had lived several lives in one. In autumn, he oversaw a new expansion of his farms, sketching ideas, inspecting fences, and directing workers with the same precision he once reserved for troop movements. He was proud of Mount Vernon, prouder perhaps than he was of the presidency itself. It was the embodiment of everything he believed a man ought to build in his lifetime: stability, growth, stewardship. But that fall, the weather shifted unpredictably. Cold rain rolled in from the Potomac, soaking fields and turning roads to muck. Washington, stubborn as always, continued riding the property despite the chilling air. On December 12th, he spent nearly 5 hours outside, checking on his farms through snow, sleet, and freezing wind. He returned home with his clothes damp and his hair wet with frost. Martha urged him to change immediately. Washington, polite but dismissive, chose not to. It was a small decision. So small he likely forgot it within minutes. But it changed the course of his final days. The next morning, December 13th, Washington woke with a sore throat. He brushed it off. Winter colds were common, and he had work to do. He spent the day indoors, but remained active, sorting papers and reviewing letters. By evening, the sore throat had deepened into severe inflammation. His voice rasped, and swallowing grew difficult. Martha grew worried, urging him to rest. Washington, ever calm, insisted he would recover by morning. He did not. Before dawn on December 14th, Washington awoke struggling to breathe. His throat felt as though it were closing, and each breath grew harsher. Martha sent for doctors immediately. The household stirred with alarm. The medical practices of the time were crude, and Washington, like many of his era, placed faith in them. The doctors bled him heavily, nearly 40% of his total blood volume, believing it would reduce inflammation. They applied blister treatments and gave mixtures of vinegar and molasses to ease his throat. Nothing helped. By afternoon, Washington understood the gravity of his situation. He remained composed, even as breathing became a desperate effort. When he could no longer speak clearly, he whispered in. News of Washington's death traveled slowly by modern standards, but by December 1800, the entire nation, from Boston's icy streets to the plantations of Georgia, was deep in mourning. Cities held processions draped in black. Churches tolled bells for hours. Soldiers wore black armbands. Newspapers printed portraits bordered in mourning lines. Even Washington's old political rivals set aside their differences. John Adams wrote that the nation had lost the most illustrious character this country ever produced. Thomas Jefferson, once fiercely opposed to him politically, described him as a wise, a great, and a good man. The grief was not just national, it was personal. People felt they had lost a father. In Mount Vernon, Martha moved through the quiet halls with a heavy heart. She sealed off the bedroom they had shared for decades, unable to enter it again. The plantation, once busy and full of life, grew still. Foreign nations mourned too. England lowered its flags. France paid solemn respects. Washington's death showed the world that the United States had lost not only a leader, but a symbol of its identity and hope. He became something larger in death than he had ever sought to be in life. George Washington once admitted he never sought greatness, only to fulfill duty as best he could. Yet his legacy grew far beyond the limits of any single lifetime. He had been a surveyor who learned the land, a soldier shaped by defeat and survival, a commander who carried a fragile army through impossible odds, a statesman who refused the temptations of power, a president who built the foundations of a nation, a man who gave more than history could ever repay. His decisions shaped the core of American identity, the peaceful transfer of power, the balance of authority, the refusal of monarchy, the belief that a leader's purpose was service, not rule. Centuries after his birth in 1732 and long after his death in 1799, Washington remains a paradox made human. Humble yet commanding, flawed yet principled, ambitious yet self-disciplined. His final gift to the nation was not victory in war or vision in politics. It was the example of character. Washington showed that the greatest power a leader can hold is the ability to step away from power itself. And in that quiet act, he became immortal.
That's all for now. Stay tuned for more Out Thank You.